That's when I finally, I said, isn't it legal? I answered questions with a question
Mm.
so that I could use up time. And then uh, there was a little congressman from Cleveland who wanted to be like Nixon. Nixon used to be on the Un-American Activities Committee, and that's how he made his
But
first
wasn't it
reputation.
J. Parnell Thomas from New Jersey that was the chair of the committee?
He was the chair of the Hollywood 10.
Oh, so this was New
Warren,
York.
he'd gone to jail already.
Really?
Yes. No, this was chairman, he'd been the chairman for a long time, and it was the same lawyer that they'd had for the Hollywood 10. So that this little Cleveland congressman kept saying, directed to answer, directed to answer. He wanted, and Chairman Warren didn't want it to appear in the record that he was saying, shut up. So he just waved his hand. There's no answer there, but he didn't want it to appear like, I don't want any First Amendment cases. I don't want to direct it to answer, And finally he directed me to answer, and Frank, a famous lawyer, said, I forgot the question. So that went on for about 2 pages, so that I even mixed them up, which is
So how long were you actually on the stand?
a good 20 minutes, which is a
20
long
minutes.
time. Good long 20, 30 minutes. Yeah,
And
that's a
then what
long
happened
time.
in the end? Did you
I
claim the
was,
first?
no, I finally took the fifth and they dismissed me. And then we had a meeting that night in Carnegie Hall to raise money, in the small hall. Oh, Elliot Sullivan was the other First Amendment. Elliot Sullivan, a fine character actor, and George Tyne, a wonderful character actor who was in that great Italian movie, a movie about the Italian invasion, and Pete Seeger, the great folk singer.
Well, weren't you, wasn't there part of your testimony that was tied in with you and Pete?
Yes, one of the things they asked me, they showed me a picture of Pete Seeger and me marching in a May Day parade. I was pushing a carriage with Lisa in it, and it was a rough May Day parade. Someone threw an apple with a compass in it, and it hit Lisa's carriage. Luckily it didn't hit her, but they were looking to wound people. And Pete was wearing his World War II uniform to show what a patriot
But he was no longer in the service, was he?
No, this was a May Day parade in the
So they said that was illegal?
about 48. And that's illegal. You're not allowed to use your uniform in an unauthorized parade. So I kind of knew they were after that. So I said, you not only want to blacklist me, you want to blacklist other people. Isn't a May Day parade legal? And I kept asking questions. That's when he directed me to answer. And he said, I forgot the question. Then he asked the question again, and I took the Fifth Amendment. But we didn't work was very light for 2.5 years getting into the blacklist. We didn't work for a middle 10 years, and then it eased up a little bit after Murrow and Cronkite and all the good people at CBS started being active for us. So it was another light 2.5
Well,
years. So it was a total of 15 years.
Didn't they expose McCarthy for being a witch hunter or something?
Yes, and it was very tough at CBS because Paley didn't want to jeopardize the network, and
He went out on a limb with Murrow.
right. And recently I saw a documentary about Sam Goldwyn, and was surprised to find that he bucked the committee. He was the only producer that did. Even without a trial, without anything, they said they would never use anyone who was an unfriendly witness. Now that's against all union contracts and everything, because you can do anything in your private life,
Well, they said that you attended communist meetings. Isn't that how they tried to say that to prove that you
Well,
were?
they said we were communist fronters.
What does
and
that mean?
That we set up these organizations like the NAACP and all these things that were doing civil rights things, that they were fronts, that communists set those up to accomplish these communist purposes of making sure that there was equal employment.
Well, what does it mean when somebody names your name?
The committee is those people who say they were in the Communist Party, and they say you can't say. Later on, Lillian Hellman and Arthur Miller said, we'll tell you about ourselves, but we'll not tell you about anybody else. The committee had made it a practice that unless you told who else was at the meetings, that
You would be held in contempt?
you would, that's right, that once you opened the subject, you had to tell,
The whole truth?
yes,
Or any questions they asked
that's
you?
right. So naming names became the standard by which you proved that you were willing to cooperate and to sever your former Communist Party
Now,
thing.
you said that you knew who named your name.
Named who?
You know who named your name.
Yes, Jerome Robbins testified.
Who was he?
Jerome Robbins was maybe the most famous choreographer, director on Broadway. And he was a genius, and he did marvelous work at the Ballet Theater, and he created shows. He
West Side Story?
West Side Story was his first big hit, and he
Fiddler.
wanted to do. He was told that he had done Peter Pan on the stage, and he wanted to do it on TV, and he was told he couldn't unless he named names.
Now, didn't they have things on people like the fact that he might have been gay and
Yes,
they would expose him?
I believe he was blackmailed because he was an early gay who didn't come out. He also had two big heterosexual relationships, one with the famous actress Lois Wheeler that I introduced him to, and once with Rosie Tobias, a dear friend of mine that I introduced him to. I knew him very well, and I even had a little flirtation with him when I was a young actress, because Lois Wheeler and I were looking for him to vote against the blacklist in Equity, because Frank Fay was a terrible blacklister, a wonderful actor who radio show I worked on, and a very funny man, but he was a zealot, a red hunter, and we were trying to get a resolution against him in Equity, and we put people on the list that we knew were left wing, and I had this Jerome Robbins on the list, and I never could find him, with about 7 or 8 other people. And then one day I was dancing at Local 1199, had a dance hall down on Astor Place when they were a young union just organizing the drugstore people before they got the hospital people. And I was doing a Lindy Hop, and this young man came over to me and said, "My name is Jerry Robbins." I said, Lois, look who's here. Here's Jerome Robbins. And he said, no. He said, "I'm doing a ballet at, I guess it was American Ballet Theater, called Fancy Free, about sailors." He said, "And I have been on the road with the ballet almost all his life," he said, "and I don't know any street dances." He said, "Would you teach me to Lindy Hop?" So I taught him to Lindy Hop, and we became these close friends, and I introduced him to Lois Wheeler, who was then in the first play about lesbians that fought censorship. It got closed up by the city council, and Equity reopened it, and it was with Lois Wheeler and a French actress, Lydia St. Clair, and a wonderful actor was making his Broadway debut and then became a big Hollywood
Was that
star.
that movie with Shirley MacLaine and Audrey
No,
Hepburn.
no, that was The Children's Hour by Lillian Hellman, but that was the first movie sort of about lesbianism. But I took Arthur Lawrence and Jerry Robbins to see my friend Lois Wheeler in this play, and they both fell in love with her. And Jerry Robbins ended up living with her for 2 years. So this was my relationship with Jerry Robbins. During the Hollywood 10, I went on a train to Washington, D.C. with a New York delegation that included big stars, Stella Adler, Luther Adler, Dorothy Parker, the great writer, headed the delegation, and Sarah Cunningham and John Randolph and Mrs. Martin Del Giro. We had this big delegation, and that's how I met Ed Chodorov, who was a famous Broadway writer who wrote Wonderful Town. And when Jerry Robbins named me, he said I was in his cell with 7 people with him. And he named Edward Chodorov.
A cell?
A cell. That's what they called a club in the Communist Party.
Like they do about terrorists now.
Yes, it was a cell. And he said in that cell was Ed Chodorov, who wrote wonderful plays, political plays. That was Jerry Chodorov. Ed Chodorov wrote the wonderful plays. Jerry Chodorov wrote musicals. And at the time Jerry named him, he had written Wonderful Town, which was one of Jerry's first commercial Broadway choreography jobs and one of his first big successes. And
were they related?
yes, they were brothers, the Chodorov brothers. And he named a dance critic, Edna Acko, who I knew just to say hello to, because her cousin, Danny Acko, was a radio actor with me.
Maybe she made a bad criticism of Jerry somewhere.
Yes, and Elliot Sullivan and a name like Keith Curran. He was married to Karen Morley.
Didn't Elliot Sullivan move to England or something?
Yes, he was blacklisted, he moved to England. But before that, at the time he named us, which he said we were in this cell in the late 40s, I was about 18. It was when I first met him. And he said, I asked him to lecture on how dialectical materialism helped him create Fancy Free. I knew what dialectical materialism was, but I certainly
What
didn't.
is it?
That's a whole other lecture. It's a Marxist philosophy.
I see.
And there are whole books written about it. But I taught him the Lindy Hop, which had nothing to do with dialectical materialism. I did not know the Chodorov brothers. I just knew Ed Chodorov from that delegation. And Elliot Sullivan and Karen Morley's husband were in the European theater in uniform in the army and had not worked in New York yet. They were Hollywood actors. I did not know them till the 50s, when they were refugees in New York because they couldn't work in Hollywood anymore. So this was a cell that was named to order. Oh, he also said Sarah Cunningham and John Randolph. During that time, I had met Sarah Cunningham because Johnny Randolph was also in uniform, and I didn't meet him till after the war. Sarah and I became friends doing our union work together. So people came to my door at Bank Street the day I was named, and they said, we know your phone is tapped. Phones were tapped, and FBI followed me once a month. The first Tuesday of every month, I could tell them in their trench coats and their hats, and they used to follow me. And our superintendent told me that they used to go through my garbage to see what my mail was. So I obviously was a big threat. But when I got named...
Didn't you once meet Alger Hiss?
Oh, Alger Hiss was a close friend after a while. Yeah, I met him in the park. I'll tell that story in a minute. because this is the story of the day I was named. People came to the door and said, "We know your phone is tapped, so we want you to know Jerry Robbins is on the radio. He named you." So I put on the radio, and then Jack Gilford came home, and this was in 52 or 53. So you and Joe had not been born yet, but I got my neighbor at Bank Street to sit with my little girl, and I said to Jack, "We are going to Sardi's." Jack was not a big star then, but Vincent Sardi always sat him in the front because Jack had entertained the USO in the Pacific, and Vincent had met him then, and they were friends.
What is Sardi's?
Sardi's is a big theatrical restaurant with pictures of all the famous actors.
Caricatures.
Caricatures, and it's a famous place on 44th Street. And
It's a very fancy restaurant, isn't it?
well, it's fancy for tourists, but these days it's more or less reasonably priced.
But back then it was
Back
kind
then
of a
it was
hangout.
considered, yeah, but they always had an actor's menu, but I said, I don't care. If we'll have a cup of coffee, we're going to sit in the front and show our community that Jerry Robbins has not hurt us, that it's out, we belong in this community. So we got on the bus, we went to Sardi's, we were sitting at a front table, and in those days Sardi's had booths where you couldn't see the people who were sitting in the booths. And it also, sometimes people called them, had somebody call them from outside, so they would be paged, and the maitre d' would go through the restaurant with the phone saying your name, so that people would know you were there, because you got jobs by networking in Sardi's. So while we're sitting at the front, George, the maitre d', who knew us, of course, is walking through the Sardi's, paging with the phone, Ed Chodorov, and he was in a booth. And so, no, he said, Mr. Chodorov. So I said to George, which Mr. Chodorov is that? Because I knew Jerry. He said, Ed. So I waited for him to be off the phone, and I went over to him and I said, Ed Chodorov. And he said, yes. I said, I am Madeline Lee. Jerry Robbins thinks we should know each other.
That's funny. So did you ever meet Jerry Robbins after that?
Yes.
What was that like?
Well, Hal Prince used him for a funny thing happened on the way to the
I
forum.
mean, all that time had passed and you never ran into him?
I didn't see him for maybe 15 years.
Nice.
And then he not only became the choreographer and fostered Jack, he crazy about Jack's work, but he began to call on the phone because he was the only one who wanted Jack for Tevye. And Joe Stein, Sheldon Harnick, and Jerry Bach wanted Zero. So they kept having Jack come in for readings because they thought he couldn't be aggressive, show an aggressive side of Tevye. And Jack was a very poor, cold reader. I was a radio actress, I could give you a good cold reading. And so
What's a cold reading?
you are given a script, you get to look it over, and then you stand under the work light in the theater, which is what they were doing at this show, or in a studio, and you read it cold. You don't know the rest of the play. Sometimes they give you the play to read and then give you what are known as sides, which is just your part. So it was a matinee day of forum, and Jerry had done marvelous work. He didn't.
Well, both Jack and Zero were in for him, right?
Were in forum, and
they were
Jerry
close
Robbins
friends.
was supposed to direct it originally, and then he chickened out, and George Abbott directed it. and Jack Cole, a famous choreographer, who everybody stems from on Broadway. And Hal Prince produced it, and it was a flop in New Haven, and it was a flop in Washington, D.C., with all the same material. Now, it opened with a love song, Love is in the Air, which happens in the show now, later. But
So it was Love I Hear.
Love I Hear.
That's correct.
Yes, I guess so. And Leonard Bernstein and Sheldon Hornick, a lot of people knew that Steve Sondheim had a better opening, but he holed up in his hotel room and wouldn't give it to George Abbott. Milton Berle claims that when they solicited him many years before to play to play Pseudolus, they had played him Comedy Tonight. So that song existed, and I do believe that Steve Sondheim did not want to give it to George Abbott or Larry Gelbart or Burt Shevelov because he wanted Jerry Robbins, and he was very stubborn about it. So then...
What, were they lovers or something?
No, he just...
Well, this was the first time that Stephen Sondheim did words and music.
Did words and music. It was his first big show.
But that was like 1962.
They had worked together in West Side Story. They had worked together
That was 57, yeah.
On other things and admired each other. And he had said yes to Forum about 2 years before.
But did Jerry ever say anything to Jack about that he was sorry that he named you?
No.
Did Jack know that he named
No.
you?
Oh, of course.
And
So,
what did Jack say to you when he learned that?
okay, that's what I'm going to tell you. Hal Prince went into Zero's dressing room as he had just come off stage and said, I know how you and Jack feel about Jerry Robbins, but he's the only one that Steve will work with, and you know the show's in trouble.
Jack Cole was the choreographer. Was he the dance director? What's the difference? Are you saying there were two choreographers in Four?
No, Jerry Robbins just put the opening in.
That's all.
That's Jack Cole's That's Jack Cole's whole show.
The Comedy Tonight was Jerry Robbins.
Right.
Oh, I didn't know that. I thought he did the choreography. Well, you told me that Jack Cole did the...
Jack Cole did the whole show, and the whole show remained exactly, with the exception of 2 numbers. Jerry Robbins got Steve Sondheim to give him Comedy Tonight and Calm. Jack got the only solo in the show. Zero does not have a solo. Free is a duet.
That's good.
Everything.
Pretty Little Pictures.
Right. So Jerry, absolutely crazy about Jack, taught him how to run up the proscenium arch, and Zero made terrible fun of him, of Jerry Robbins. And anyway, Zero said to Hal Prince that night, and then he called Jack in, and he was still sweating when he said what he just told Hal Prince. He said, I told Hal Prince, what do you mean you know what Jack and I think or feel? We're professionals, and we're working here. If he'll do his work, we'll do our work, but we'll never eat with him. Never have anything sociable with him, and he never did. Now, years later...
But didn't you say Jack said he wasn't going to do the show?
Jack called me that night and told me this happened, and he said, well, I have to quit now. I can't work with the man who named my wife. So I said, you're not going to blacklist yourself. You stay there. And
because you said you knew it was going to be a hit, right?
That's right, and we needed the job very badly. Well, the proof of the fact that no one wanted Jerry but Steve Sondheim is the financial setup. Usually when you get in a show doctor, which Jerry was, everybody shares a little percentage with him. The only people who gave Jerry Robbins a percentage was Hal Prince
Robinson.
and Steve Sondheim. No George Abbott, no Larry Gelbart, no Jack Cole, no Bert Chevaloff.
Well, what was Jack's relationship with Jerome Robbins?
And as soon as they started working, it was as if nothing had happened.
No, but
Work
before
is
that,
work.
did they have any relationship?
No,
Oh,
he never knew him.
no.
No.
But I thought you said Jack Cole was sort of the essential, quintessential choreographer or something.
He was the most innovative choreographer for Broadway.
So Jerry must have admired him.
Oh, yes. And he left everything the same.
And
Miles Gloriosus, all of those wonderful, very funny.
courtesan dances.
Yeah, absolutely. That's all Jack Cole.
What was Hal Prince's role in all this stuff about the blacklist?
He was very good. He's very good politically. And Judy Prince's stepfather is George Tyne. So she was 9
You
years
must have
old
known
in
that.
55. That's Mrs. Hal Prince. And it was a terrible heat wave in 55. And we'd rehearse in George Tyne and her mother's apartment, Ethel Tyne. And she'd bring us glasses of ice water. There wasn't that much air conditioning in those days. We had a terrible
Well, how did
time. It was
Hal
very hot.
Prince get all of his money?
Huh?
How did Hal Prince get all of his money?
He comes from money, but he was a stage manager, and he raised it with Carl Fisher Sr. was his big
But then
general
later
manager.
he was the director of Cabaret, wasn't he?
Yes, that
So,
was his first big hit.
a few years later, he still worked with Jack.
Oh, very much so.
Do you think he was
Close.
qualified as a director?
I think he has problems.
Loss for next weigh-in will be 5 pounds.
5 pounds?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I'll try my best for 5 pounds.
Best of luck to you.
Good job.
Where were we? Shall I begin?
Well, we talked about Jerry Robbins and Stephen Sondheim. We talked about Pop being up for Tavia,
Yes. Oh,
Hal Prince. But let's change the subject anyway. We talked a little bit about your family and talked about the blacklist and you and Jack. Why don't you talk about whatever you feel like talking about?
okay.
Current events or something. Just how you feel about what's going on these days.
Oh, well, what I'd like to say is that because of my relationship to Jack, I had a very exciting life. Jack did about 20 Broadway shows. Oh, you were asking me about Hal Prince as a director. He was a very talented director, producer, but he became bored and liked to move on. He gets exciting notions. He got the idea for Cabaret when he was in the army, stationed in Germany after World War I, and he saw a dwarf in a bombed-out nightclub being an MC, and that's where he got the idea for the Joel Grey part.
Well, did the Joel Grey part have anything to do with the original Berlin stories, the Eye as a Camera? Or whatever?
No, the whole idea of placing
I
it.
didn't know he was a director. I thought he was mainly a producer.
He has become mainly a producer.
I thought the Cabaret was very well directed.
Oh yes.
Must have been.
Yes, well, it was his first big directing job, and the idea of placing the Berlin stories in a cabaret was his. And he gets these brilliant
Yeah, but
ideas.
Sally Bowles worked at a cabaret, didn't she, in the original stories?
Yes, but that's how he blended it. And he gave the idea to Joe Masteroff, who blended it, I thought, very well. And then they also did She Loves Me, which is still Cabaret and She Loves Me are playing all over the world. I've seen it in London, and
Well, sometimes they change these musicals around after, you know, a movie or something has come out, and then they change the original book of the musical because of something that occurred in the movie later on. That's
they've
why.
added a number here